Roll it. I think we are live. Da-da-da. Yes, I'm here anyway. Welcome to my very first webinar. Sounds like something they should have gotten Spider-Man for, but he wasn't available, so they got me instead. We'll say our opening prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. And Our Lady, seat of wisdom, pray for us. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, coming to you from my office here in St. Joseph Hall. Greetings to all of you, wherever you are, hunkering down from escaping the coronavirus. My topic for this evening, as promised, why the monarchy? Reflections on Old Testament politics. And hello, Carol. I should mention I can't see you or hear you, but I do have the chat window open. So if you have a question or a comment along the way, then there'll be time for questions at the end. I'll hopefully keep my talking part to under an hour until break. Hour total, never fear. All right. For those of you who have studied the Summa, should be all of you, at least we're assigned parts from the Summa, a phrase you'll sometimes see, also in other scholastic writers, is this principle: whatever is received according to the mode of the recipient. That is, you kind of take things in according to what you are or who you are. So me being a professor of philosophy, I tend to look at things from a philosophical angle. It applies to reading the Bible as well. I'm always looking for philosophical tidbits, particularly for the theme of this talk of political philosophy, which of course, political philosophy I teach every a couple of years. And some of you may not know, back in the old days, back in the previous century, my first teaching job was a community college in Texas, where for 3 semesters I taught a course on the Bible. So I was a Catholic teaching the Bible to Protestants at a secular college. It was actually kind of entertaining. It was quite fun. It quickly for me burst the illusion people often have that Protestants know the Bible well. At least the ones I had didn't know the Bible particularly well. It seems so often Protestants know a few passages, particularly those to bash Catholics with, but don't really know the kind of the big story, the context, how things fit together. Then after that, I moved to Denver and taught high school for a year and would tell the tale and taught a Bible among my other classes. All right, so a little bit of background for me while I'm doing this. And the topic, why the monarchy? Reflection. So not claim to have a deep studying thesis, just my own thoughts, reflections on this topic, the monarchy in particular in the Old Testament. On the one hand, you might have seen this title say, well, what else are you going to have if you have a large group of people spread out geographically in the ancient world before cell phones or even telegraph? What other form of government are you going to have? Perhaps have an aristocracy or oligarchy, ancient Rome or Carthage, but by and large, in ancient world, you had a kingship, a monarch, as kind of the really only practical form of government. Yeah, so why not? Okay, anyway, thank you very much for your time. I'll take it. No, okay, no, I'm not done yet. All right, okay, that's, you might say, well, it seems like obvious, that's what you would do, but not really obvious when you come to the book of Judges. Yeah. That there's an alternative. They didn't necessarily have to have a monarchy. In fact, they did between the time of the Exodus and the full beginning of the monarchy with Saul and then eventually King David. So what's going on? All right, so to kind of back up then a little bit, historically, of course, before the Exodus, before the sojourn in Egypt, you have the time of the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Really more just kind of family history rather than a nation. You've got a small group of people with the father as the head. It's only after the Exodus that now you have a large community where it seems that some sort of more establish social order, something a little more than the family relationship is needed. So we have patriarchs, we have the sojourn, 400 years or so in Egypt, and then the Exodus, led by, of course, Moses. So Moses, and then his right-hand man and eventual successor, Joshua. Obviously, keep these guys together. You need some kind of leader. In this case, it's Moses, and Joshua is his military leader. As Joshua eventually leads the people into the promised land. Remember, Moses dies on the east side of the Jordan. He gets to see the land but not enter it. Joshua leads them in, conquers part of the land. There's still some of the natives are still left. You're familiar with Joshua, Jericho, and all that. I'll assume you remember at least some of the high points. I'm going to just try to keep to my key themes to keep this within a manageable time. So, all right, we have Moses leads them out of Egypt. Joshua leads them into the promised land. There's some battles, but some of the pagans are still left in the land. The people kind of just go disperse to their inheritance, to the land, divvy up among the 12 tribes and to the individual families. And you have a period of time known as the time of the Judges, as related mainly in the book of Judges, though the book of Ruth also takes place in this time period. Period of certainly over 200, maybe 300 years, depending on which chronology you accept for the Exodus and the beginning of the monarchy, but certainly well over 200, probably 300. So longer than the history of the United States for the American listeners who might be out there this evening. And what else are you going to do tonight with COVID after all? Come on. Watch your reruns. All right, so time of the Judges. That's what I want to focus on. It's the middle portion of my webinar. And so what's going on? It's certainly not the rule of a monarch. You certainly don't have anything like a kingship here. In fact, there's really not any kind of government at all, so to speak. It's almost, if you ask what's the form of government, you'd almost be inclined to say this is an anarchy. You might also call this the libertarian paradise. You can do pretty much what you want. There's no central government, not much government at all. Those of you who may remember from your time in Barry's Bay, around the town, there's even a sign, one of these signs on Mask Island. There are those signs up, back off government. That kind of sign would be kind of silly during the time of the Judges. There was no government to tell to back off. There seems to be everyone was kind of pretty much on their own. No central government, no taxation. Nobody fixed up the roads or did anything like that either. If there was a particular kind of function, structure within the tribes themselves, it's not really apparent from the book of Judges at all. It seems to be very much do what you want, a very frontier, Wild West kind of feeling. Of course, they were expected to obey the law of Moses. So there were still the Levites who'd go to offer sacrifice, either a free will offering or atonement for sins. But you were pretty much on your own. And a recurring phrase that appears throughout the book of Judges was, at that time, there was no king in Israel. And at the time, there was no king in Israel. And the longer form, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what seemed good to him. Or another translation, everyone did what seemed right in his eyes. Everyone kind of is left to their own devices. So a way to kind of think of what's going on in the book of Judges and how this kind of fits into the whole kind of history of salvation, the history of the Old Testament, is it's a time of testing and a time of trust in God. Testing, a time of trust in God. Whereas they're pretty much on their own. Think back to the Exodus. Moses is up getting the 10 Commandments, and while he's up there, the people build a golden calf. Moses comes down from the mountain. He's so angry, so upset, he hurls the 10 Commandments to the ground and shatters the tablets. And this is the first known case of someone breaking all 10 Commandments at the same time. What does he do? He gets Joshua to get his troops and restore order and deal with these people. There's nothing like that now. You can't go to your phone, call 911, ask for the heresy police, you're pretty much on your own. So the question is, are the people going to follow the law of Moses? Or are they going to keep the covenant when they're left to themselves? And basically the answer is no. The whole book of Judges is an account of people abandoning the covenant, practicing idolatry, even people fighting between the tribes. It's not a very edifying book in some passages. So definitely a time of testing. And people often violate the covenant. And as a result, God lets them be oppressed, harassed by some of the pagans who are still living in or near the land. The Philistines, the Midianites, et cetera, et cetera. These different groups. And so eventually they repent, they turn away from their sins, pray to God for deliverance, and God will send someone to liberate them. So it's a time of not just testing, but also trust. Are you going to trust God to deliver you? Are you going to trust God to keep his end of the bargain after you've turned back from your violation of the covenant? So you might say, even though this time of the Judges seems like it should have a lot of benefits, lots of freedom, lots of doing whatever you want to, don't have to pay any taxes, anything like that. It'd be very appealing. On the other hand, big downside. One, of course, the downside of this time is the Israelites falling away from the covenant. But externally, they haven't completely conquered the land. It was only partially conquered by Joshua. So there's all these other tribes, I should say, other nations, other peoples, non-Israelites, who don't like their neighbors, who don't like the Israelites, and will fight against them. And the people find themselves oppressed, and they don't all combine together because they're all separated into these tribal units, various parts of Palestine. So the Judges, yeah. And when approaching the book of Judges, we're a bit confused by what we call a judge. Really, I can't think of any of the judges in the book of Judges who are like the judges that we normally think of when we think of judges. I think that's something Bilbo said at his party. When we think of a judge, we think of maybe in Canada a guy with his white wig on, someone who sits at the bench and has a gavel, maybe Judge Judy or whoever's the popular judge on TV these days. That's not what the judges were doing. Of course, probably the most famous of the judges, Samson, is not a guy you'd actually go to if you had a dispute with your neighbor about who the fence belongs to. The other hand, if you have a criminal band come to your neighborhood and start stealing your car, Samson might be exactly what you're looking for. So the judges are really primarily military leaders. They're not necessarily particularly wise, think of Samson, but they're men of action, men that are called, I guess also woman Deborah, one of the other judges, to respond to a particular situation. So there's this time of testing, but this time of trust that you appeal to God and you trust that he will provide you with some kind of redeemer, some kind of savior, in this case, the judge. So then to contrast, to bring it back to this theme of the monarchy, well, how does a judge differ from a king? Well, very importantly, a king, a monarch, is someone who's established. He's got his regular place he hangs out, his palace. He's got his regular army. He's got his officials. There's taxation, roads are built, things are happening. So there's some kind of orderliness, structure, stability. So a king can be proactive. The king doesn't just have to wait for something to happen. If he sees a problem, he can go send some of his soldiers to do something about it, or send his bridge builders to go do something about crossing a river. Judges, on the other hand, are very much reactive. The judge is just an ordinary citizen. They're just Clark Kent until some kind of emergency arises. Then he's called upon to leap into action. And then when this action is done, he just will go back to his normal life. So king, proactive, the judge, reactive. A king, something established. We also tend to think of a king as something that runs in a family, hereditary. You pass the rulership to one of your children, usually the firstborn son, but other ways work as well. Whereas a judge is kind of a one-off. They're individuals that are called, and their children may not have anything to do with judging after them. So a judge is called for a particular emergency, and really only for this emergency. This particular situation, once they're resolved, the judge's work is done. They don't pass his authority on. They don't have any kind of structure, the trappings you expect with a more permanent government. And they're primarily military leaders, not really the other functions that a government typically does. All right, let me pause for a moment. A little sip. Let me resume. Okay. People were haven't dozed off just yet. Okay, I was looking over. I noticed my watch has decided to stop at this very moment. Well, actually, no, I've got the pin out. I adjusted the time because I assumed the computer was correct. Now we're with it. No extra charge for that part. All right, again, I'm not going to go through the whole book of Judges. That would take a lot of time. I just want to focus on this theme, the monarchy and why, and the alternative. So for our purposes, the most important judge in the book of Judges is Gideon. No, not the guy who leaves the Bibles in the motel room. Their inspiration, the judge Gideon. Particularly his story is told in the book of Judges, chapters 6 through 8. And I'm not going to go to all his details. You're probably familiar with Gideon. First, kind of reluctant. He's not really persuaded that is this really God speaking to him? You know, does he really want to get involved in this? So there's the whole thing of the sheepskin, having water on it or not having water on it, dew in the morning, and all that. Finally gets persuaded to go, makes a sacrifice to God, and because his neighbors are all worshiping the god Baal, which is a no-no. They've broken the covenant. Eventually, he gets some people together. You know, the whole story of Gideon and his trumpet, and that's all in Judges 6 to 8. But the key point from this vantage point is what happens at the end. So these driven the Midianites away. The people are really grateful, and some of the people have the idea, hey, this guy is pretty good. You know, this guy really can dealt with this emergency well. You know, maybe we should kind of have him hang around. You know, instead of us going back about our business, and next time somebody else causes trouble, having to wait for a new judge to emerge, why don't we have him set up a more permanent kind of shop? And this is what's happening in Judges 8:22. I have to use my magic magnifying glass. So, you know, all the youngins out there, you know you're not young anymore when you reach the point you have to actually take off your glasses to read things. I'm afraid I've reached that point. Anyway, magnifying Judges 8, chapter 22. So the Israelites, so people of the tribes, come to Gideon and say, rule over us, you, your son, and your son's son, for you've rescued us from the power of Midian. So he wants his function to become hereditary. He said, Gideon, why don't you just kind of stay in place? We'll set up a kingship. We'll set up a monarchy. We'll have, instead of these random judges that emerge over time, we'll have kind of one ruling person, one ruling family, and this will pass on. That's the idea. So even at this stage, they're saying, well, maybe this time of judges isn't really so great. Maybe it's time to move on. And Gideon's reply in the very next verse, so this is 8:23, I think is interesting. So Gideon says, I will not rule over you. I'm not going to do it. He says, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. You know, I'm not going to do it, or don't think of bypassing me and going for one of my sons to be your king. He says, why not? He says, the Lord must rule over you. The Lord must rule over you. So his point is, well, God gave me a particular mission. God gave me this mission to drive away the Midianites. End of story. Mission accomplished. God didn't say anything about me setting myself up as the king. That's going beyond the mission. That's going beyond God's plan. And he reiterates again kind of this big theme at the end: the Lord must rule over you. So you might say, if you were to ask, well, what's the form of government of the Israelites during the time of the Judges? You might say it's a theocracy, ruled by God in a really very direct manner. So if there's some kind of emergency, there's really no human or agent, there's no human authority to go to. You have to really go directly to God. You have to pray, offer sacrifice, atone for whatever violations of the covenant have been done, and trust that God will send someone. Like I said, the time of the judge is a time of testing, but also a time of needing great trust in God. It's really all in God's hands. God sometimes works in mysterious ways. So you have Deborah, you have Gideon, you have Samson, some of the more famous judges. So Gideon is kind of keeping to the spirit of his commission. He was told to do this particular action. He says, I've done my job. I'm going back to my farm. It's not my business to make myself king. It's really not the Israelites' business to make him king. It's really God's people. If God wanted them to have a king, God would have picked some, just as he chose Moses and Joshua to lead them out of Egypt and into the promised land. And again, pause. Now, if I were to ask you, luckily I can't see anyone to call on anyone. If I was to ask you, who was the first king of Israel? Probably some of you would say King David. Wrong. Some of you a little more savvy would say Saul. Also wrong. This is your, should be a piece to impress friends or your next, might be a while to your next cocktail party, but your next virtual cocktail party. Now, the first king of Israel, not David, not Saul. I suppose you could argue Moses was, but while they're in the land, the first king, Abimelech. Probably not a household name. Abimelech, for those who are curious, Abimelech, Abimelech. What's he doing here? How's he get into the story? All right, so back up again to Gideon. So Gideon, a great deal of prestige. People want him to be king. He declines. Says, no, I'm not going to be king. We're going to keep God as our king, trust God to deliver us in emergencies. So Gideon kind of goes back. I mean, presumably he would still be a very prominent person in his community, lots of prestige. And Gideon had a very large family, even by academy standards. He had 70 sons. He had more than one wife, obviously. 70 sons. We don't told how many daughters. But he actually had, yes. Carol doesn't know everything. That's why I'm the one doing the webinar. That's a student chiming in. I said, don't feel bashful. I do have the chat window open. If you do have any questions, that things that aren't clear, just certainly pop in. All right. So he had 70 sons by his wives, but he also had a concubine, a sort of a wife of secondary rank. And her son is Abimelech. So Abimelech is the son of Gideon, but not considered kind of like the inheritor, kind of one of the main sons. But Abimelech, unlike Gideon, is actually rather ambitious. He kind of likes this idea of being the king, huzzah, and all that. So he goes to some of his people, and Abimelech's story is told at the end of chapter 8. Just talks about his birth, but mainly the story of Abimelech is Judges chapter 9. So again, it's quite short, and even then I'll just pick on the high point. But anyway, Abimelech goes around to people, particularly of his tribe. He says, look, instead of having all the sons of Gideon kind of, being kind of your authority, the people you go to, kind of mini judges, and probably anytime you have a group of people, you're going to have disagreements. Go to one guy, they tell you something, go to another guy, advise you something else. One of the arguments against a rule by many. There's that old saying, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. So Abimelech says, instead of having all 70 sons of Gideon as kind of your judges, why don't we just have one authority, one ruler? Hey, how about me? So he persuades people to accept him as the ruler, as the king. And just to kind of firm up his position, he goes and kills the other sons of Gideon. Because again, being children of the kind of the first rank wives, they of course will have a greater claim to be king of anybody. So he doesn't want to have any rivals, so he kills them all, or almost all. One of the sons escapes, the youngest one, Jotham, not the city where Batman hangs out, but Jotham, Jotham. And Jotham runs away, gets away, and he runs up on a hill and kind of makes a speech to some of the Israelites, kind of vent his anger before he runs away to avoid Abimelech getting a second chance. And this is kind of I find a real intriguing little bit, this little story. This is actually a story about some trees. The trees deciding that they want a king. So you got talking trees. You wonder, have I stumbled into Middle Earth here? Or in ancient Israel, do they have some kind of substance that's not legal in Canada? What's going on here? No, so it's kind of a parable, you could say it. So this is in the book of Judges, chapter 9, verse 7 to 21. So they give quite a great length, relatively speaking, to the story. So in the event, Jotham tells a story. So the trees decide they need to have a king. Animals got lions, trees need a king too. So they look around for candidates, and first they go to the olive tree. Of course, the olive tree, very important. Olive used for cooking, medicinally, all that. They say, oh yeah, the olive. Let's get the olive tree to be our ruler. And however, the olive plant declines. And this is in still that chapter 9, verse 9. The olive says, must I give up my rich oil, whereby men and gods are honored? So remember, oil, in addition to serve its food purpose, was also used in lamps. You had oil lamps like in the sanctuary where the ark was. So lots of uses for oil of the olive. The olive says, well, no, I have to, if I become your king, I'm going to have to spend all my time ruling you. If you think about it, being a ruler, being a politician, is really a lot of drudge work. You have to be responsible and do all sorts of things in your audiences, to deal with enemies. People are always complaining, why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? Yeah. So I said, no, I've got better stuff to do with my time, like produce these olives, which useful for men, honors the gods. So the tree is not deterred yet. They go to another tree down the line. They find a fig tree. Fig's an important food, of course, in ancient Middle East, ancient Israel. In fact, there's a saying in the Old Testament, a sign of prosperity is that in days of Solomon, everyone was under their vine and their fig tree. You had vine for wine, and you had your own fig tree to have as many figs as you want. So it goes to the fig tree. So why don't you be our king? And the fig tree also declines this. This is verse 11 here, still in this chapter 9. The fig tree says, must I give up my sweetness and my good fruit and go to wave over the trees? If I spend all my time ruling, I'm not going to have time to produce these figs, which are so sweet. So still not deterred. They keep on going, like the Energizer Bunny. That would have been funnier probably back in the 80s. They go to the vine, the grapevine. Why? Okay, I'm surprised they didn't go there first. They would probably give the best parties if he was ruler. So they go to the vine, and the vine turns them down as well. 3 rejections. Ouch. Says to them, this is in verse now 15, says, must I give up my wine that cheers gods and men and go to wave over the trees? So wine cheers gods and men. You think of the pagan gods all chilling out, having some wine. All right, so yeah, if I'm ruler, then I'm going to have to give up this other important noble function that I perform. So the trees rejected the 3rd time. So they try to go to these various plants, these trees that are considered to be sort of noble, important, impressive, get rejected. So they're working their way down the scale, and now they go finally to the buckthorn. Excuse me, I think it was verse 13 with the vine. The buckthorn. Interesting. I was looking up buckthorn. It's not native to Canada. It's from the old world, and I just typed in something like buckthorn, and a little ways down the page, there's these sometimes you'll see like questions, and one of the questions was, is the buckthorn good for anything? And basically the answer was no. Apparently the berries aren't even edible. So this kind of brambly, worthless kind of plant. And they go to the buckthorn. Says maybe this guy's got nothing better to do with his Saturday nights rather than ruling. And so the buckthorn says to them, and this is again still chapter 9, verse 15, says, if you wish to anoint me king over you in good faith, come and take refuge in my shadow. Because if you're really serious, then you need to kind of come close and obey me. You have to be under my shadow. You want to be my subjects. Says, if you really want to do that, sure, all right, I'll do it. Otherwise, let fire come from the buckthorn and devour the cedars of Lebanon. In other words, if you're really going to be half-hearted, if you're not really willing to obey, then you guys can go to the underworld of your choice. So that's Jotham's story. Basically, the moral of the story should be obvious. The only one tree they could get to want to be their ruler is the most worthless one. All the noble, valuable plants have other things to do rather than rule. It's only this sort of worthless plant, nothing better to do, who becomes the ruler. So his point, obviously, Abimelech is sort of the worst of this bunch of Gideon's sons. He's the one that they wind up with the ruler, whereas the other sons, except for him, have been killed. And there's the old saying, the best qualification for someone to be a bishop is someone who doesn't want to do it. Someone who recognizes their limitations or has other things they would rather be spending their time doing. Anyway, while I'm making this connection to political philosophy, Aristotle makes this comment, I think in book 3 of the Politics, or I think in maybe book 2, point that he's a little bit leery about people running for office. He says this kind of shows too much ambition. The best qualified people should be gotten to rule whether they want to or not. Just a side little note for the geeky Aristotle crowd out there. You know who you are. So then Jotham makes this declaration. Then he hightails it out of Dodge. It's time to get out of here. So the rest of chapter 9, story of Abimelech, he goes about his thing, establishing his reign. So he's killed off his rivals. Now he's fighting against cities that aren't accepting his rule. So eventually he's besieging a tower, and a woman inside the tower gets a big millstone, drops it from the tower, and crashes on Abimelech's head, shattering his skull. And as Abimelech is lying there dying, he tells his sword bearer to come and stab him, because he doesn't want it to be said that he was killed by a woman. And that's the end of Abimelech. Go and do likewise. No, that's not one of the go and likewise moments. What's really, I find interesting, is then how the story of Abimelech is concluded. And this is in still that chapter 9, towards the end. This is so 9:55. When the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they all left for their homes. Boom, the king is dead. Dude, I guess let's go home. Nothing what else to do. No sense of the king is dead. Along with the king, here's the successor. It's just over. In other words, Abimelech wasn't able really to establish a true monarchy, a true kingship. It was very much an individual thing. He tried to become king. He wanted to be ruler. Presumably found a dynasty. But after his death, the whole thing just kind of falls apart. It didn't really go anywhere. So he's not usually who you think of when you think of the founding king of Israel. He did claim to be king. Judges calls him king over Israel, but it's kind of a dead end. Then things go back to the way they were again. On my final page, hopefully, some people are still out there. All right, I think there's actually time for a little breath. Okay, all righty there. Also time for a drink. So to kind of pull things together, heading towards the full monarchy at the end of the time of Judges. So I want to turn now to the first book of Samuel. And really the beginning of the first book of Samuel was really kind of a continuation of this book of Judges. You have the same scenario in those first 7 chapters. There's the Israelites are just out on their ancestral land. There's no central government, but you have these judges. And particularly the opening 3 chapters of 1 Samuel is the story of, hold on to your hats, Samuel. Never saw that one coming, did you? The story of Samuel, Samuel's parents, if you're familiar with, and then him getting left at the sanctuary, no temple yet. And God speaking to him, and Samuel doesn't know it's God. He runs to Eli and says, "Did you call me?" And he sends it back. It's actually sort of a bit humorous. But Samuel becomes the last of the judges. So really there, the judges ends at the beginning of Samuel. Interesting though, unlike the judges in the book of Judges, Samuel is not a military leader. He's more like what we would think of as a judge, someone who's wise, settles disputes, also a religious leader. So he's priest, eventually apparently high priest, as well as a prophet of God, but not really a military leader. So he's a little bit different than the other judges. He's also different that he judges all Israel. So the other judges are really just judges over one tribe, or maybe some tribes that they kind of work together with, but it's always a part of Israel. Only Samuel is described as being judge over the whole country, the whole kingdom. All the Israelites kind of look up to him, accept him as having some kind of authority, not the authority of a monarch, of a king, but someone who has a great authority, great prestige, who's turned to, that people turn to. All right. In Judges, 1 Samuel 4-7 is really the background leading up to the establishment of the monarchy. 1 Samuel 4 opens with a situation you're familiar with from the book of Judges. The people are being harassed, invaded, oppressed by some other people, in this case, the Philistines. The Philistines are giving them trouble, and the people are rather worried. They're invading their territory, raiding, even conquering their cities. So the Israelites finally said, we need to take extreme measures. We need to bring out the heavy artillery. We need to call in the Ark of the Covenant. You all know about the Ark. You've all seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Ark of the Covenant. They remember what Joshua did with it. So they said, well, it's time to bring out the Ark used against our enemies. Problem, though, the ark is something that is a very special object, not just because it zaps Nazis, because this is really something very sacred. Remember, the Ark of the Covenant carried in it the Ten Commandments. It also had, at certain points, a jar of manna, as well as the rod of Aaron. But this was where God manifested himself over the ark in the temple. This is where sacrifices were made. The ark was not visible, but the ark was kind of the center of God's connection visibly with the people. And so Joshua was not just allowed, but really ordered to use the Ark of the Covenant. So it wasn't Joshua deciding, hey, let's get the ark and carry it around the city. Now, this is part of the mission. Part of Joshua's duty was to use the ark. But then after that, the ark remained in its tent. It was not used at all during the time of the judges, because God never told any of the judges to do anything with it, to take it. It wasn't really, you might say, within their authority to do that. As I mentioned, after I taught at the community college in Dallas for a couple of years, I moved to Denver, Colorado, taught 1 year of high school and lived to tell the tale. I taught a class in the Bible, and I had a quiz, and on the quiz, there was a trick question to see whether or not people had done the reading about the story of Samson. So I asked them, how does Samson use the Ark of the Covenant against the Philistines? He didn't. So I had one guy say he threw it at them, which sounds like something Samson would do, but that wasn't the right answer. None of the judges had anything to do with the ark. The ark was sacred. God himself had to give you permission in order to actually do with it. It was Joshua had used it, then it just stayed in the tent under the care of the Levites, the high priests, and that was it. You didn't do anything with the ark. But the Israelites, now in their desperation, think it's time to bring it out. So going back to the theme of Judges, it's a time of testing. This time they're tested by the Philistines. But the time of Judges also very much meant to be a time of trust in God. This is where the Israelites are failing. They're not trusting that God is going to give them some kind of orders, send a judge, make something happen. They're really taking matters very much into their own hands, which wasn't part of the deal as laid out in Judges. So they on their own authority, the people get the ark, they get some Levites, actually the sons of the high priest who were kind of crooked. You might remember Eli, the high priest, his two sons are kind of skimming off the top of donations and doing other shady things. And they actually end up getting killed in this battle. It's injustice. But anyway, the sons of Eli carry the ark with the army. The Philistines hear about this. They've heard stories about back in the old days, the ark, what it did. They're a bit scared, but they buck up and go out to fight. And the Philistines defeat the Israelites, and they even take the Ark of the Covenant captive. This is bad, Leroy Brown, bad. The Israelites are very much devastated. Like, not only are we beaten, not even the Ark of the Covenant could save us. And the Ark itself has been captured. Bad times here. So eventually the Ark of the Covenant is sent back. The Philistines take it to one of their temples of their god Dagon, like dragon without the R. And it causes the statue of Dagon to kind of fall over. It also gives people tumors. Missed that part, Raiders of the Lost Ark, I guess. Yeah, so they decide this is kind of, we don't necessarily want this around. So they end up sending it back with some statues, little gold statues of tumors. It's a Philistine thing, you wouldn't understand. Okay, so at least they get the ark back. They still haven't won any battle. Of course, what one would expect, if you read this right after the book of Judges, well, maybe they learned their lesson. Maybe they need to beseech God, offer some kind of sacrifice to seek God's aid, to get some kind of other judge, Samson 2.0, to come and deal with the Philistines. But that's not what happens. Instead, they go to Saul with a request. So it seems like they recognize, yeah, we have a problem here, but they have their own solution. And this, of course, is a very famous passage. I'm in the first book of Samuel, the 8th chapter. And this is when the people come, of course, and request a king. Right. Going on a bit longer, but I'm kind of winding down, don't worry. Okay, so the people approach Samuel because he's kind of the prophet, he's the priest, he's the judge. They basically tell him your sons are all losers, Samuel. We can't really turn to any of them. Apparently Samuel's getting up there in years. Again, Samuel's not really a military leader. So they decide what we need is a king. We need to establish a monarchy, just like the other countries. Other countries have a permanent leader who organizes the people, has his own army, leads them into battle. That was the main duty of a king in the ancient world. We should have the same thing. Instead of just kind of reacting to things, waiting for God to send us a deliverer, we want to have something we can rely upon. So a kind of a lack of the same kind of trust in God as they were expected to have during the time of the judges. So chapter 8, verses 7 to 9, Samuel was presented this petition of the people to God, and God replies to him. Samuel himself was kind of displeased with them. So in other words, you're kind of making up your own plan. This isn't, not God's plan. If God wanted us to have a king, he would have told us. He would have said, "Oh yeah, make Gideon your king, or go find that guy over there picking mushrooms. Yeah, he's make him your king." Anyway, okay. 1 Samuel 8:7. God says to Samuel, "Grant the people's every request. It is not you they reject." It's not because they think you're a lousy judge. Don't take it personally. They are rejecting me as their king. As I said, the judge is really very much a theocracy. Who's the king? God is the king. If there's a problem, you take it directly to God. That's the setup in the book of Judges. So you have to really have trust that God is going to act, in a way that maybe you didn't expect, maybe not right away, but they don't want that. They're uncomfortable with the uncertainty. They want something more regular, something more established. And so anyway, God continues there. "As they have treated me constantly from the day I brought them up from Egypt to this day, deserting me and worshiping strange gods, so do they treat you too." And the story of the Judges, constant story of people not keeping the covenant, not keeping the promise that they had made to the covenant. Again, didn't even start at the time of Judges, even way back Moses. Moses is gone for a little while, and they start bringing out the golden calf. Okay, so God says, this isn't the plan, but go ahead if that's what they want, but give them a warning. And it's something that's worth pondering here in the Old Testament about the establishment of monarchy. You might say there's two sides to this. And at this point, you have the negative side, the dark side. I think I just committed some copyright infringement there. Oh, nobody did. All right, so the warning part, it continues. This is still 1 Samuel, chapter 8, verses 10 through 19. Again, I'll just hit the high points. Okay, so God says, this is what you're going to tell them. This is sort of the warning of what the king's going to be. What's the king going to do? What's his rights are going to be? He will take your sons and assign them to his chariots and horses, and they will run before his chariots. Well, if you expect the king to be someone to fight against your enemies, he's going to need something like, soldiers. You don't get soldiers by planting teeth in the ground. That's Greek mythology. So he's going to take, recruit, however, the young men, the young men. So instead of them hanging out, working on the farms, helping you with your job, they're going to come live in Jerusalem or live in the fort cities and be his soldiers. So your sons are going to be somehow taken, recruited into his military and be his commanders. And also going on in that same passage, set them to plowing and harvesting. The king is going to need some means of feeding his troops and some kind of income, whether it's sort of direct taxation or just having his own farms and vineyards. He's going to need some means of support, both supporting his army, paying his soldiers, feeding him, supporting himself, his palace, his officials, all these things. Whereas in the time of the judges, none of that. No king, no government to have to give anything to. And your children basically hung out with you on the farm until they went off and got married. Or maybe if they were the sons, maybe they got part of your land. But they were pretty much nearby. They were pretty much there until maybe they left to start their own families. He will take your daughters as ointment makers, as cooks, and as bakers. Now there's the whole support staff. Some people to make the things that the soldiers need. Someone to food and bakery and sort of ointment, things for medicinal purposes and things like that. So all this apparatus, the government is now going to be required. He'll take the best of your fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his officials. His officials are going to need some source of income as well. And all that. And then he goes on there. In 18 says, when this takes place, you will complain against the king whom you have chosen. It sounds like this is the thing you need right now, the greatest thing since sliced bread, probably the greatest thing before sliced bread at this point. But at one point, you're going to get sort of annoyed, like, hey, wait a minute. What's wrong? No, this isn't right. Says, yeah, at some point, you're going to get annoyed. And on that day, the Lord will not answer you. You're going to be out of luck. Don't come crying to me, guys. You had your choice. But however, this goes on, it says the people refuse to listen. So, they think, well, this bad stuff, maybe in the future, there's this downside, but that's a small price to pay for being able to deal with the Philistines or whatever threat may come up in the future. In other words, they're warned of these things they're going to complain about later, but they don't take Samuel's warning seriously. Well, okay, we can live with that. It's not so bad as dealing with the Philistines. Also, to make a note, so this, of course, happens rather soon. Those who know your biblical history, remember, of course, King Solomon, son of David, has his big building projects, the temple, so his own palace and fortresses and all sorts of things. So taxing, getting people to work very heavily for him. When his son Rehoboam takes over, the people are really upset at this point about all the work they have to do, all the money that Solomon is requiring for his building projects. So they go to Rehoboam and say, look, we worked so hard for your father Solomon, and he was so demanding. Could you kind of lay off us a little bit, and we'll be thrilled. And Rehoboam has kind of two groups of advisors. He has the older men, the kind of the more mature men, the more gray-haired, and they say, these guys put up with your father Solomon and his demands for 40 years, without rebelling. Cut them some slack. They'll love you. Things will go smoothly. But then Rehoboam goes and hears from basically his buddies, the guys he goes drinking with or goes hunting with, and they want to play Mr. Tough Guy. Says, man, don't give those guys an inch. So he takes their advice and he goes back to the people, and said, basically my little finger is bigger than my dad's leg. He beat you with whips, I'll beat you with scorpions. Not the animals, it's like this whip with metal in it. The people get so annoyed, they forget this, buddy, and the 10 of the tribes break off and form the kingdom of Israel. Well, that won't be on the test. There's a little tidbit. So anyway, people get very very soon upset from that line, after the death of King Solomon. Also point out the monarchy was no guarantee against falling into idolatry. In the kingdom of Judges, time of the Judges, everyone was on their own. People fell into idolatry. During the kings, people fall into idolatry, sometimes, unfortunately, led by the kings themselves, starting with Solomon, his foreign wives, having altars for them, and going to the point that some of the later kings even practicing human sacrifice of their own sons to the pagan gods. Okay. So on the negative side of the monarchy, of course, Saul, the first king, doesn't turn out so well. King David establishes the line of David, the stable monarchy that rules for several centuries, about 400 years or so. That's from 1 Samuel, get kind of the negative view of the monarchy, the negative side. But rather curiously, there's also a positive side. And don't worry, I'm kind of wrapping up. I went on a bit longer than I wanted to. And this makes us turn to the second book of Samuel. And in 2 Samuel, chapter 7, is that, of course, the story you should be familiar with, that David decides to build a temple. He's looking back, he's been successful, he's become the king, Saul's been displaced, he's got this palace to live in, and he notices, well, the Ark of God, the covenant, kind of the temple, in quotes, is basically this tent left over from the days of the Exodus. It doesn't seem quite right. God has given me the kingdom instead of Saul and given me prosperity, and he's just got this tent. It's like God's wearing this T-shirt. David got to be king, and all I get is this lousy tent. So David, speaking to the prophet Nathan, who's kind of his spiritual director, I guess, tells him his idea. And Nathan thinks, oh, that's a good idea. That's Nathan speaking under his own authority. But that night, God speaks to him and with a message. So the next day, Nathan goes back with this message of David to David. So not his own authority, but God's authority, and tells him not to do that. He says, no, your son Solomon, he'll be the builder of the temple. But he again kind of gives this really strong promise to King David. So this is 2 Samuel, again, remind you, chapter 7. And he says a few things. Again, I'll just hit some of the high points. Like in verse 11, the Lord will establish a house for you. And in fact, down in verse 16, your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before me. Your throne shall stand firm forever. Of course, by house, he doesn't mean the physical house, the palace. He means the house in the sense of the dynasty. So the line of David, the house of David, will endure forever. His throne shall endure forever. You might say, whoa, hey, time out. I thought this monarchy business was a bad idea. You want to just keep punishing the people by having the king. What's going on here? So I said, this is kind of the flip side. The speech to Samuel, there's the negative side. There's all these things to complain about the monarchy. Because ultimately, the establishment of the monarchy is based on a failure to fully trust God. That God will keep his promises, that God will always look after his people no matter what. So they want to have some kind of human authority to go to. They don't want to always go immediately to God in their emergencies. They want to have someone kind of fill in, someone established who can take care of their problems. So on the one hand, it's a negative thing, but here with these promises to David, it seems to be a good thing. That not only you're not just king for a while until people have learned their lesson, but this throne of David will last forever. What's going on here? And perhaps one might think there's this saying that people have it: God writes straight with crooked lines. There's the monarchy may not have been the original plan, but that's where the plan is going. In other words, God, this isn't what the people should have wanted, but God is going to bring good out of it. This is going to be worked in for the good, ultimately. Of course, though, as one gets starts blah, 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 need the drink. It's on sale at LCBO this month. As kind of expected, though, from what you've seen of the Old Testament, of course, the Israel, it's pretty a safe bet. The Israelites are going to mess up. They're not going to keep the covenant. I've already hinted, eventually, later on under the kings, idolatry flourishes. Many pagan gods are worshipped. The kings become unjust, even practicing human sacrifices. So the kingdom is brought to an end. A bit after the year 600 BC, kingdom is overrun by the Babylonians. And then from thereafter, really, the Israelites no longer have a political unit. They no longer have a nation. So it's not, you can't really speak of what form of government. They're under someone else's government. So there's the Exodus, time of the judges, time of the monarchy, and then subject to someone else. First the Babylonians, then the Persians and the Greeks, and eventually at the time of the New Testament, the Romans. So the nation is taken away from them. They no longer have a kind of their own political chief. Of course, the only exception during a brief time, you have, of course, the Maccabees, the Maccabee brothers, about 2 centuries before the time of Christ. The Maccabees are kind of a bit peculiar because they weren't of the line of David. So they weren't ever actually kings. They were actually the tribe of Levi. And they also messed up politics with who was the high priest. So they kind of lost support. And this is where the Herods kind of fit in, being vaguely connected to the Maccabees. But in general, during this time, after the kingship, there's no entity, independent nation of Israel. They're under the authority of some other power. Now, there's a bit of a paradox here. So they've lost their political independence, but they've benefited, oddly enough, in another way. Just to put it this way, again, something else for your next cocktail party or tea party. It's during this time of exile, after the fall of the monarchy, fall of Jerusalem, that a new institution emerges. We don't know exactly when. The institution of the synagogue, literally the assembly. This is a new thing. Because back before the fall of the monarchy, what you had was the temple. You really were only supposed to worship God there, that you had these high places, these shrines that people worship God, but they weren't really quite legit. They weren't sort of authorized. But the focus of worship was the temple. That's where the ark was. That's where you did sacrifices. Of course, after the destruction of Jerusalem, no more temple. It's only rebuilt later under King Herod. So no more temple, but you do have people realizing, we kind of messed up. We messed up really badly. What was that? What was up with that? What was the problem? People weren't following the law of Moses. They weren't keeping the covenant. What do we need to do? We need to make sure people keep the covenant, know the law. How do we do that? We teach them. So the synagogue, the assembly, a place of instruction. So you wouldn't have sacrifice. That only happened at the temple. But you would go basically have readings, particularly from the books of Moses, the prophets, and the rabbi, teacher, who wouldn't be a priest, would give what we call a homily, trying to explain it. So even, for example, at the time of Jesus, we see him going into the synagogue on the Sabbath, and traditionally any Jewish male could be called up to read. So he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, and it seems like he's maybe been asked to give the homily. He's this itinerant preacher everybody wants to hear. Says, come to the synagogue on Saturday. Hear, Rabbi Jesus speak. Probably sell tickets and popcorn here. Okay, maybe it's okay. It's getting late. What can I say? All right. So even though the Jews now are lacking a kind of political independence, during this era, you don't encounter idolatry like you did during the time of the judges or even the time of the kingship. So even though they've lost their political freedom, during this time, they've gotten themselves together and are trying to ensure that never again is there this widespread idolatry, unfaithfulness of people to the covenant. All right, let me just wrap up final thoughts and going over the time I wanted to do. To back up to King David. So there was that promise in 2 Samuel chapter 7, your house, your throne will endure forever. Now the Jews are thinking, well, they're under the rule of the Babylonians or the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans. Like, wait a minute, David's kingdom lasts forever, but we don't seem to have a kingdom of David. Oh, well, we must be being just merely chastised for our unfaithfulness, like happened often in the time of the judges. And at some point, this kingdom of David will be restored. So this is just a temporary hiatus. You know, the line of David is not ended. This is just a temporary period, and then there'll be a restoration. The king will resume his throne in Jerusalem. You know, we'll kick the bums of the Romans or the Greeks or whoever happens to be our ruler at the moment that they're thinking, and everything will be hunky-dory. Now, one of the distinctive features and how the king was often described was as having to do with his anointing. So the high priests were anointed, but so was the king. The king was anointed. There's a religious kind of dimension. So the king was the anointed of the Lord. And some of you may already know, perhaps you heard that in scripture class or in a sermon, anointed is, of course, not a Hebrew word. It's actually from the Greek. In Hebrew, the anointed would be altogether, not the Plato, it's a different class, the Messiah. So the Messiah, the anointed. This idea that there will be a new Messiah, a new anointed, a new king of the line of David, who will restore the kingdom. However, Jesus turned out not to be quite the Messiah many people were looking for. It wasn't quite what they had in mind, because he's not really out to establish an earthly kingdom. Many Jews at the time of Jesus were expecting a renewal of the political order in the state of Israel, but that was not his plan. So in Christianity, there's really kind of no kind of form of government sort of set up officially, different governments in different sort of parts of the Christian world, because Jesus' kingdom was spiritual kingdom. So you might say this promise to David is fulfilled, but at a higher level, transformed from just a political rule of earthly kingdom to the spiritual world. So maybe put it this way, you might say in the book of Judges, who is the king? God is the king. In the time of the monarchy, who is the king? Well, the descendant of David, that's the king. In the New Testament, who's the king? Jesus is the king, who is both God, but also the descendant of King David. So it kind of brings together these 2 points. So like the time of Judges, calling upon people to trust him, to have confidence in him. Okay, so I think I will kind of wrap that up. Those are sort of my thoughts. So why the monarchy? Well, why not? The one hand seems obvious, but God first gave the people a chance to kind of do things on their own and to show their trust in him, which actually often didn't happen. That old lines from the gin blossoms, you don't expect too much from me, and I might not be let down. It would also be a subtitle for the book of Judges. So this Judge is a time of testing and a time of trust. So the Israelites constantly failing the test, failing to keep the covenant, the worship of God. So they're somehow afflicted, and then now is the opportunity to reaffirm their commitment to the covenant and their trust in God. You might say that forms a lesson for later Israelites and also for us today. This kind of radical trust. The people eventually find this a bit too much of a roller coaster ride for them. You know, they want something more established. We want a regular channels to go through. They established the monarchy, which, as God points out to Samuel, well, this really is really a rejection. You're really rejecting this trust that I'll act in the way that is best. They said, okay, if that's what they really want, go for it. But eventually they're going to find there's a downside to this. This is a win-lose scenario. But since that's the way you guys want to go, I'm going to do something with it better than you were thinking about. So the kingdom of David is transformed into the kingdom of Christ. And that's the end. So thank you for your patience, for your time. Just have time for a few questions if you want to type them into the chat. Don't all type at once. Or if you have no questions, either I've answered any question you might possibly have, or you've been put to sleep, or you've wandered into the kitchen to get a beer and haven't come back in time. Okay, I'll just sit here for a moment, see if there's questions. Okay, well, while people are thinking of questions, I'll tell a little anecdote. So my high school teaching time, by the end of the year, I was pretty burned out. And I wasn't looking forward to grading a bunch of essay questions for my Bible class. I had 3 sections, so like 100 students with these Bible tests. So I decided to go the easy route and have a multiple choice Scantron final exam, open book, open note on the book of Revelation. So I had 40 questions on the book of Revelation, some of them pretty silly. Some students forgot to bring their Bibles. So I had some students ask me, so I walked in, there were some extra Bibles. I handed one student the Bible and they asked me, excuse me, where's the book of Revelation? I said, go to the back. Lesson that open book, open notes tests only really help if you actually know what's in the Bible and have your notes. I think some people got like 5% right on an open book, open note, multiple choice exam. One of the reasons I'm not a high school teacher. Anyway, thanks, Mary Claire, for your note of thanks. Another moment to see if there's other questions. Maybe not. Hopefully, I've inspired some of you to do some more reading in the Bible. The Book of Judges is always kind of interesting. It has the advantage you have these kind of short stories. You don't have to read a whole bunch at one time. This question, Carol, can you comment on the divine right of kings and its legitimacy? Oh yeah, okay. Back to the book. Interestingly enough, the divine right of kings really is a Protestant idea. At least historically, how it arises in Europe, the kings really claiming their own authority. Interestingly, I'll kind of back up to your question, Carol, in a moment. Hilary Belloc made this comment that really the divine right of kings idea is still very much with us. You might say, "Whoa, what are you talking about? That's totally 300 years ago." But really, the essence of the divine right of kings is the king is the final authority in his country. You can't appeal against the king. The king is basically the agent of God. So what the king says goes. And Hilary Belloc's comment is, well, the modern secularized version is there's no appeal beyond what the government says. The government passes a law, says you have to do this. There's really no other appeal. You can't say this is against the natural law or this is against Catholic tradition or the Pope says not to do that. You can't make that appeal today. So the political order is is the highest arbiter. The modern secular state doesn't recognize there's anything higher above it. Chesterton made this comment that he said the biggest argument against an aristocracy is a priesthood with no God. It's kind of self-sufficient, nothing above it. So anyway, a divine right of kings, yeah, biblically, that's definitely not the situation in Israel. I mean, but definitely there is a sense that the Israelites, kings, were always subject to the law. And there's even a passage, Deuteronomy, I think 17 or 18, where even Moses is given passes the message. Well, if you decide to have a king when you're in Israel, you can do that, but he has to be an Israelite, not a foreigner, and he shouldn't make alliances with other countries because then that involves worshiping their gods, and he should have a copy of the law and read from it. You should know what the law. This idea that the kings aren't the highest authority; they're subject to ultimately the divine authority. So yeah, in terms of the divine right of kings and its legitimacy, well, you can say it's not really legitimate unless God actually was to give a king this authority and say, do whatever you want. Don't think that God's ever done that. Yeah, but certainly, divine right of kings is really the idea that the king is really can't be questioned. And this is really not a medieval idea. People often have a kind of really hazy idea of history. People think things about the Middle Ages that actually are from later periods or earlier periods sometimes. So divine right of kings is not a medieval idea. If you read like St. Thomas, other scholastics, even other early modern authors, there's never a sense that the king can never be challenged, that the king can't be judged by some standard. Really the whole history of the Middle Ages, or at least a big part of the political history of the Middle Ages and the history in general, is the conflict between the papacy and individual kingdoms, or bishops and rulers in that. So the whole idea of really divine right of kings really comes about after the Reformation. When the kings are forming their own churches, and for example, King Henry VIII wants to be head not just of the temporal order, but also the spiritual. He wants to be the sole ruler, and other monarchs kind of follow suit. Again, kind of almost a throwback to pagan kingship, where the kings was both the high priest as well as the ruler. I just remember one of Julius Caesar's job titles on his resume was high priest. He didn't need to be religious to be the high priest in ancient Rome. So anyway, Carol, I hope that's answered your question. If not, if you have a follow-up, let me know. So as they say, last call for alcohol. Give maybe another 10 seconds, see if there's any comment. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, well, thank you everyone, for whoever was out there. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope this is a bit of a blast from the past, and wish you all good evening. Hope everyone is staying healthy. So you all have a very good evening.